Hello, my name is Dave Jennings, and welcome to Walking with Jesus Christ, who is Jesus Christ. And in these first classes, we'll be looking at how Jesus Christ is spoken of in the Old Testament. There are some important tips which we'd like to share with you about how to uncover these kinds of gems. And it needs to be said here at the beginning that Jesus is spoken of and spoken about through the entirety of the Bible. But as we read the Old Testament, it's hundreds and sometimes thousands of years before Jesus' birth. And so Jesus, we are going to see, is the center of the plan and the purpose of God. The passages that we read today are going to allow us to see how many prophecies were given about Jesus and how many were fulfilled, and in many cases are yet to be fulfilled. But during the times of the Old Testament, these visions of the upcoming Messiah, the Messiah who would come, and his work were so critically important because it was the center of their hope. Even during times of persecution, they could look forward to the Messiah coming. And as I said, many of those Old Testament passages have been fulfilled, and many of them are yet to be fulfilled. For us today, they are a bright, shining light to us. It's a beacon of our hope as we look forward to the return of Jesus and see passages in the Old Testament that are yet to be fulfilled. So let's start in Luke chapter 24. And this is on the road to a little town called Emmaus. Now, after the crucifixion of Jesus, many of the believers that were in Jerusalem understandably had their faith greatly shaken. And even after the resurrection, some they just didn't understand, or perhaps they just didn't believe that he had actually been raised from the dead. They didn't understand that he needed to die, and they didn't understand the resurrection. And the accounts of women who had seen Jesus and some of the apostles, it just seemed too much to believe for many of them. And there were these two men who were walking from Jerusalem on a 7.5-mile journey to go back to Emmaus, a neighboring town. And so Jesus takes the time to go and to meet them on the road to Emmaus. But he doesn't reveal who he is. And as Jesus is walking along the road with them, he asked them why they were so downcast. Why were they so sad? And one of them, a man who we are given his name is Cleopas, he said that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified. And he goes on to say, we trusted in him, but he is now dead, and he'd been dead for 3 days. And while they had heard some stories about the resurrection, they were unconvincing. And they themselves had not seen Jesus in a resurrected form. So they were giving up. They were going home. All hope was lost. Now, in our search for Jesus, we get an insight into who Jesus was. He knew the sadness and the dejection of these disciples, that they were leaving. And he purposely goes to them along that road and walks with them in order to restore their faith. So what do we know about this story? Well, Jesus, first of all, asks them, why are they sad? And then he says to them, and this is recorded for us in Luke 24 at verse 25 through 27. He said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So there you have it. The greatest Bible class of all time, led by Jesus Christ. And what was he teaching them? He was going back to the Old Testament, back to the beginning writings of Moses, starting in Genesis, and showed how there were so many passages that spoke of him. These men had read them before, but they had not seen Jesus in them. Jesus interpreted these writings for them, and he opened their eyes. And their reaction, well, it was quite a reaction. After Jesus tarried with them and he shared a meal, they finally recognized him. But the reaction to Jesus' teaching from the Old Testament was that they said to one another, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" When we read through the Old Testament, the same can be true for us. When we see how Jesus was spoken of in the Old Testament, it arouses within us a deep spiritual feeling. Our hearts can burn within us too. So during these 5 brief classes, we're going to be taking a look at examples from Old Testament writings, going back to the writings of Moses, into the Psalms, and into the prophets. You know, scholars estimate that there's more than 450 references in the Old Testament specifically about Jesus. They're not always easy to identify, and in some cases, we are able to see that a scripture from the Old Testament was speaking about Jesus because a New Testament writer, or even Jesus himself, wrote about it and spoke about it and showed how it was being fulfilled by Jesus Christ. But there's a number of literary forms that we see in the Bible that help us to be able to understand how Jesus is being spoken of in the Old Testament. There are types, signs, symbols, foreshadowing, and prophecy. So we use these literary styles to uncover Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. In our second class, we'll look at examples of Jesus found in just the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Jesus as the light, Jesus as the seed of the woman, and Jesus foreshadowed by the provision of animal sacrifice after the sin of Adam and Eve. In our third class, we'll look at the sacrifice of Isaac and how it points forward to the sacrifice of Jesus 2,000 years later. In our fourth class, we'll look through the Psalms and the Messianic Psalms that talk about the role of Jesus 1,000 years to come. And in the fifth and last class, we'll examine prophecies from the prophets about Jesus and telling us about his role. So stay with us and examine along with us these wonderful parts of the Bible which help us to know who is Jesus Christ.